Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with the Actually Tiny House Project, where we are exploring smart, simple, sustainable tiny house design and giving you some building tips along the way. Now, today what I want to talk about is actually a hidden danger that we encountered halfway through our tiny house build here. And that's a big part of this whole thing that we're doing. The reason we started this channel is we didn't want to just share our successes. We wanted to share whenever we ran into a problem. And the problem we're running into here is we just built this amazing deck and beautiful porch roof off the side of our tiny house, and it is making it extremely difficult to get anything else done. So I'm going to walk you through this deck construction and also this kind of unique porch roof construction. But I want you to realize that if you decide to follow in our footsteps and build something like this, there is a good chance that you will never finish your tiny house. You could actually slip into an inescapable state of relaxation. You might lose your job, but on the bright side, at least you'll have a half-finished tiny house to live in. So getting started here, the deck that I am sitting on right now is just about as standard as a normal deck gets. It's concrete blocks, Simpson ties, pressure treated beams, and outdoor wood on the top. And I like to get really crafty and DIY with most of what I do, but sometimes there is a good argument for just doing things the standard way, and I think decks are one of those. I'm not going to invest in a bunch of really expensive, really precious cedar just to create a surface that I could walk on. And sure, this would be a lot nicer if it was completely timber framed, but that's going to take weeks and weeks out of my time, and this is something that we can put together in just a couple days. So the deck surface here is 21 inches wide, which is a great surface for a tiny house because it keeps your deck slightly under the trailer. And if you're going to be pulling a tiny house in and out, it's really important that the deck isn't mashed right up against it, because you're going to damage your tiny house while you try to turn the trailer out of the location that you're in. It's also really nice because you can just sit right on the edge right here, super comfortable place to hang out, and it expands the effective size of this deck out to about here. So overall dimensions for this thing are 5.5 feet wide. It's about 14 feet long, got some stairs coming up right here. And then there's a little bit of a step up from the deck surface into the front door, which is actually a good thing because not only do we have what I just talked about, which the deck being below the trailer so the tiny house can move in and out if it has to, but also you're not tracking nearly as much debris inside the house. Now, as far as these posts you see coming up here, now things are starting to get a little bit fancier. I had these really beautiful old growth Douglas fir beams that were reclaimed from an old house project here in Portland, and I've just been sitting on them for a couple years because I knew at some point there was going to be a perfect project for that, and that is this right here. This is 3 posts coming up. These are 4x4s supporting a 4x6 old growth Douglas fir beam that is supporting the porch roof that's coming down on top here. And that's most of what I want to talk about in this video, because porch roofs are super nice. It really expands the effective, usable living space of your tiny house. It gives you good sunshade, it gives you protection from the rain, it gives you a really beautiful place to hang out. Just a really nice thing to have. But you kind of have to think about some special issues with a tiny house, because a tiny house is designed to move, which means at the very least you need to make sure that there's a little bit of flexibility in the components between the fixed deck that you're going to be building if you decide to go that route and the roof that's attached to the tiny house. Because if the tiny house settles or it moves a little bit, you have to accommodate for a little bit of motion in that joint there. There are people out there that are taking little decks and having them fold down off of a tiny house, which I think is pretty cool. But if you're talking about a front deck like this, which is really wide, I think that's going to add kind of an unnecessary amount of weight to your tiny house. And if I'm going to do something that's going to fold down, I'm going to have it be the roof, because if you have a fold down porch roof like this, it can actually close in the entire front of the tiny house, which is going to give you good protection for these big, beautiful French doors or a sliding glass door while you're driving down the road. So I think what I'm going to do here is just step up, talk a little bit about this porch roof. This is a design that I've been working on for something like 15 years now, and it's based on the concept of a Chinese junk sale. And the way that they managed having big ships in ancient China with large sails is they broke those sails up into little panels, because if you can run battens across there, suddenly the forces that develop aren't nearly as strong, and you can have a much smaller structure that can support a wider area. And that's the basic philosophy behind the roof structure that's overhead of me here. what it is basically just 2x2s. In this case, these are 1 3/4 inches wide by 2 inches tall. They're really heavy duty. If I was just doing it out of normal 2x lumber, I think what I would do is go 1.5 by 2.5 inches tall and make sure that I cut around any big knots in that. And they are screwed into the same size pieces on the end here with number 10 4-inch long screws, which I'm not sure if that's exactly the strongest way to attach that, but it seems to be working out for me. And then what I do is I stretch a big white tarp over the top of the whole thing. And this is a heavy duty white tarp. And then I sandwich it down with battens on top that get screwed down through the tarp and into the wooden structure. And those battens actually bridge across the outside rails, which means that they connect everything together and hold everything nice and tight. And I've built 4 of these over the last couple decades. They seem to hold up pretty well, even though they're fairly lightweight. The tarp that I have in here is really the weak link in the whole thing. It only lasts a couple years, but sometimes 3, sometimes 4 years, depending on where it's located. But the reason I go with a heavy duty white tarp as opposed to a commercial awning fabric is 1, it's a heck of a lot cheaper, but 2, it lets a lot of light through, and it just develops this really beautiful kind of Japanese lantern effect that everybody that walks by really comments on. And if I could find a commercial fabric, even if it was expensive, that would give me that same effect but would last a lot longer, I would be totally open to that. So if you're listening to this and you have a better idea, definitely send it to me or put it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear people's different ideas. But what I've done with these particular roofs over the years, it's just every few years I take the tarp off and then I put a new tarp on there. And it seems to work out pretty well. Now, just a few more details on building this here. Assembling this whole thing was actually pretty easy. What takes time is just cutting everything and then piloting for all the holes and then coating everything with a couple coats of whatever exterior product is going to last the longest. We're using Timber Pro in this case, but I'm sure there's lots of other alternatives. I always try to pilot for all of my screw holes before I put my coating on, so there isn't a weak spot that's going to be prone to causing this to rot prematurely. Now, once I've got all my pieces put together, the big challenge here for assembling this is just creating a really wide, flat surface that you can put the whole thing together on, because if you just start trying to assemble this in a kind of a wonky surface, you're going to find out really quickly that it's hard to get everything level and square enough and get it to come together really tightly. And so much of the integrity of this is just going to come from those screws locking everything together. So you don't want to put it together twisted, because it's going to be harder to flex into the right space, and it's not going to be nearly as strong. So what we did was we set up 2 sawhorses with really long boards on top, and then we had some 20-foot long 2x4s that were sitting on edge, and that created a roughly level plane that we could set everything up on and then screw it all together. And then before you put the porch roof on, just like if you're building a wall, you've got to take a corner to corner measurement and make sure those things are equal, so it's going to be nice and square. Because once you stretch that tarp on, it's kind of locking it in, and if it gets tweaked or needs to be in a different position when you actually put it on the house, well, then you're kind of screwed, because it's going to make the tarp wrinkly on one axis. Now, actually stretching the tarp on, what works really well for this is to put this out in the sun and let it sit for a couple hours first, so the tarp can get nice and pliable and stretchy, and then you can go around the perimeter and pull down really hard and staple with a staple gun, pulling the whole thing tight the same way that you would pull a canvas onto a picture frame. And then you can go ahead and put the battens over the front and then sandwich everything down. And it's not a bad idea to actually take a diagonal piece and screw just a temporary diagonal member across the top of this and then raise everything into position. Now, this is not a super lightweight thing. I mean, it's definitely lightweight. It probably weighs, I don't know, maybe 300 pounds, maybe 200, I'm not sure. But it was definitely bigger than we could just handle with 2 people. We ended up using 2 of us and a neighbor and a rope overhead to raise this up. And you really do have to support it nice and evenly, because it does have enough flexibility that it could break before it gets in place and gets hooked onto the house and also settles down on top of the beam. So those are just a couple tips for building the overhead thing here. The beam itself is fastened together with long structural screws. I've got 8-inch long structural screws coming down through the 5-inch beam, penetrating 3 inches down, and it wouldn't be bad actually to use a 10-inch structural screw for that. I like using structural screws in this application because if I want to disassemble this whole thing in the future, I can just go ahead and pull everything apart, and I can just collapse it down, take it to the next location where the tiny house is going to be. Now, the way that I attached this to the tiny house is I attached it with some pretty heavy-duty hinges that are screwed on with really big structural screws, and these need to be screwed straight through the siding, straight through the rain screen, through the plywood, and directly into, you know, structural, really heavy studs on the inside of the wall. Because if you were to try to screw something like this in just through the siding and through the plywood, that would not be a strong enough attachment. There's a potential that a wind gust could tear the whole thing off of your house. And so I was super meticulous to make sure that I piloted holes through and checked exactly where those holes were piloted before I put long structural screws through the hinges. Now, how I actually located those hinges is important here, because if you want this to be able to fold down perfectly in the future, those hinges need to be right in a straight line. And the best way to do that is with a string. So we've stretched a really tight string along the line of our roof up here, and then I used that with just some spacer blocks that represented the height of the porch roof, and I put the hinges up to that. Now, if you look at the hinges, what you're going to notice is they actually have little blocks on top of the hinges before we get up to the underside of the wooden battens there. And what that's for is to actually push the entire thing outwards from the building a little when that hinge folds down. Because if you don't have that, what will happen is as this whole thing tries to fold down, it's going to start binding against the doorknobs and the trim details and any of the slight protrusions from the front of the house. As far as how this front part works here, this entire structure is screwed onto the deck, but it's not screwed on permanently. So I've got the 4x4s that come up and support my low deck here that's sitting on top of these big concrete blocks. I really like the big round concrete blocks because they're just a super heavy duty way to do this. You can get those smaller concrete blocks, but they're not quite as secure. And the reason I don't like, once again, poured footings for something like this is the whole idea behind a tiny house is it's a temporary thing, meaning that if we pull the tiny house out of here, I want someone to be able to disassemble this deck. I would, however, take these beams with me, and I would fold the roof down and lock it to the front of the tiny house, and that would protect against rocks coming up off the road, which is, you know, pretty cool. Another thing you could do if you were building something like this is you could put a metal roof on top of there, and that's not going to give you that same translucent effect, but it does painted white on the bottom, so it would reflect a little bit of light, and it would be a much stronger structure because you would get shear out of the metal roof. And if you were to fold it down in front of your tiny house, then you could really lock things up tight, and it would actually be a security measure as well. So these beams here that go up and the beam on top, these are designed to be unscrewed, and we can fold this thing forward, and then we can fold the porch roof down, and we can actually clean it off really easy, and it's really easy to replace the tarp. And that's a really important feature here, because if you have something that is designed to be replaced every 3 years, you'll be surprised by how fast that 3 years goes by, and it's going to really suck if you have to do something really complicated just to be able to replace the tarp or just to be able to clean things off. Now, the final thing you're probably wondering about is how strong is this really, and how long is this really going to last? I can't make any promises about the structural integrity of this. At some point, you know, if I put out a plan for it, I might see if I can get an engineer just to run the numbers, because I'm sure there's a couple places that we can either take strength away or increase strength in the way this whole thing is built to make it a lot more balanced. I can say that I've seen these go through moderate windstorms, not hurricanes, but, you know, 60, 70 miles per hour, and they have managed to stay attached. The way that I generally attach the roof is not by screwing this down. In this case, I'm actually going to pilot some 3/16 holes through probably 5 or 6 of these framing members in the porch roof, and then I'm going to tie with some really heavy duty strong nylon cord down to my main beam right here, because that creates a strong but slightly flexible attachment as well. Because once again, over time in a tiny house, things might settle and things might move, and if you don't have a flexible joint between the porch roof that's attached to the tiny house and these beams here and the overhead beam that's attached to the deck, there's a chance that you could create some pretty intense stresses on any of the attachment points there. Final thing I want to talk about is just this little metal pipe that I have going up above here. What that is just a standard piece of Schedule 40 half-inch black pipe that we went ahead and with great effort scrubbed all the lacquer off of, so it's just a bare piece of metal pipe, and that's going to slowly rust out over time. And this is mostly a decorative member, but it is really nice. It's something I've done on a couple projects now, and it just gives a really nice kind of Japanese effect. It's a nice place to hang plants. If you're going to actually hang off of it with your hands, or like a hanging chair or something like that, you do need to either put some eye bolts in there to support it, or you can do what we did, which is just take some 3/8" rope and put it to hang around it, so we could hook the S-hooks for our hanging chairs on, and we could move it to wherever we wanted, which seemed to be a pretty good solution, so we don't overstress that feature. Now, I guess last thing, I keep saying this, but this is the actual last thing I'm going to say here. I want to talk about these hanging chairs right here, because these are a huge feature of this tiny house. We've made sure to actually incorporate attachment points on the deck and attachment points for these all over the interior of the house, because the whole idea behind a tiny house is you're really trying to add versatility to all of the spaces. And the more that you can have a space be completely opened up so you can use it in a different way, the better. And that means that less built-in furniture is better, and the ultimate less built-in furniture is just a hanging chair that you can take down and put out of the way under the bed in the cabinet. And these are also super duper comfortable. I found these on Amazon. They came highly recommended. I got these two honestly just because they weren't bright, horrible colors, just really nice kind of muted colors, and they are comfortable as heck. So we're going to put a link to those in the video notes down below here. If you have any more questions about this porch roof structure, if you have questions about dimensions on any framing members or anything else, just go ahead and leave a comment. I try to keep up with those and I try to respond. If you want to check out anything else that we do, you can follow us on our website, which is actuallytiny.com, where we've got lots of other tiny house videos and a bunch of other tiny house resources. We also post a daily build blog on Instagram, which is @actuallytiny, where we're constantly updating text and photos and time-lapse videos of everything we do here, including building this entire porch roof. Okay, that's it. Thanks for watching. Take care. Be safe building your tiny house.